In the heart of Mexico, in a region where wild nature and human brutality meet, lived Alejandro Vargas, a respected rancher in the small town of San Sebastián. His ranch was a haven of tranquility, where the arid land transformed into fertile fields under his command. But this calm was about to be shattered in a way he could never have imagined. One night, while tending to his animals on the vast expanse of his property, a black pickup truck appeared on the dusty road leading to his house. The first thing Alejandro noticed was the muffled sound of tires cutting through the dirt, as if trying to approach silently. He knew it wasn't the time for visitors. When the headlights shone in his direction, something instinctive within him alerted him to the danger. 5 men got out of the pickup truck, all dressed in simple clothes, but their dark eyes and rigid posture betrayed their true nature. They weren't ordinary farmers or laborers. They were cartel members, and Alejandro knew it right away. "Where's the money you owe?" The man's voice in front was sharp, a muffled whisper that carried the weight of a death sentence. The farmer swallowed hard, but remained calm. He knew he had nothing to fear, or at least that's what he believed. However, something was wrong. It wasn't just the cartel's henchmen there. Something else was moving in the shadows. Alejandro Vargas was no ordinary man. He had grown up in a family of small farmers, but his skill with the land and his knowledge of the region's traditions had earned him a position of respect. San Sebastián, a city located in the interior of Mexico, had a history marked by struggle and resistance. There, the old settlers still told stories about how, many years ago, the city had resisted invasions by bandits and even large cartels, fighting for what was theirs with what they had. For Alejandro, the farm was more than a means of livelihood. It was a legacy passed down through generations, a deep bond with his land and his family. But this story of resistance was beginning to be tested. The cartel that was beginning to infiltrate the region was no ordinary group. It was a powerful organization with branches reaching the most remote corners of the country, and even its humblest members were capable of immense acts of cruelty. The man leading the group that had invaded Alejandro's ranch was Juanito Ortega, a henchman known for his blind loyalty to the cartel leader. Juanito had a history of violence and unbridled ambition. He had risen through the cartel's ranks brutally, leaving a trail of corpses in his wake. His motivation was simple: power, money, and a need to prove himself, as if all the blood he had spilled could fill a void in his soul. Alejandro, on the other hand, had always believed his life could be simple, focused on family and the countryside. But time and the pressure of the world around him began to force him to question his own limits. He knew something bigger was at stake when Juanito's actions began to affect not only his finances, but also his community. On the night the cartel raided his property, Alejandro tried to maintain his composure. He looked at each of the men with a steady gaze, but his heart was racing. He knew that simply offering money or giving in to Juanito's pressure wouldn't be enough. Something more was at stake. But while all this was happening, no one noticed that someone was watching from the shadows. Outside the ranch fence, another pair of eyes watched the scene. Someone far more powerful than any of the cartel's henchmen was present, just waiting for the right moment to act. An old ally of Alejandro, whose loyalty to the rancher came from darker times, was lurking, ready to intervene, but only when necessary. As the cartel men surrounded Alejandro's ranch, the rancher couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was about to happen. He knew the thugs weren't just debt collectors. There was something more, something hidden in the subtext of what was going on. Juanito Ortega, with his cold, menacing smile, seemed to be testing his limits. He wanted more than just money. He wanted something Alejandro couldn't give him. "There's no point in running away, Alejandro," Juanito said with a crooked smile. "Either you pay us or the farm will be ours. And who knows, maybe you too." Juanito's words sounded like a threat, but Alejandro couldn't give in. He knew the ranch wasn't just property. It was his life, his family's life, and the only legacy left from his ancestors. Any sign of weakness now would mean losing everything. Meanwhile, the observer in the shadows began to move. His presence was difficult to perceive, but his eyes were fixed on the scene before him. He knew that, in time, Alejandro would reach a turning point. And that turning point would be crucial, not only for him, but for everyone around him. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew more tense. The cartel members surrounded Alejandro's house, searching every corner, looking for something that even Alejandro didn't know existed. The rancher tried to maintain control of the situation, but the pressure was mounting. He knew it wasn't just money at stake, but something much deeper. At that moment, the figure in the shadows drew closer to the farm, its presence still invisible. Suddenly, a scream cut through the night. It wasn't Alejandro's, but one of the henchmen approaching the house's entrance. The sound of a gunshot echoed, but it wasn't followed by screams or commotion. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Juanito, realizing the commotion, ordered his men to spread out across the property while he moved closer to Alejandro. The tension in the air was palpable. Something was about to happen, and no one knew exactly what the next move would be. Alejandro felt the reins of the situation were rapidly slipping away. But at the same time, a feeling of something inexplicable began to form within him. Something was happening in the shadows. The farmer then decided to act. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. He grabbed an old hunting rifle that was stored in the closet and strategically positioned himself at the entrance to the farm. He knew that if he didn't confront Juanito now, he would never have another chance. But as he prepared for the confrontation, the figure in the shadows took a decisive step, subtly but devastatingly emerging. While Alejandro prepared for the imminent confrontation with Juanito, a different tension hung over the small town of San Sebastián. Over the years, the cartel's presence in the region had begun to affect the lives of the residents. Those who had once lived with a relative sense of security now found themselves at the mercy of criminals disguised as merchants, extorting money from everyone without hesitation. It wasn't just Alejandro's farm at stake, but an entire community suffering the consequences of the cartel's violent actions. Alejandro's wife, Mariana, knew the situation was about to explode. She had noticed the signs that her husband was in danger, but, as a rancher's wife, she also knew her position in town was threatened. Though tense, she had remained calm until the moment the cartel men began to surround the property. She knew something needed to be done. Mariana was not a woman to be easily defeated, but the situation was beyond her control alone. She sought help from people in town who, like her, knew what was at stake. Among these allies was Ricardo, an old friend of Alejandro's and a former policeman who now lived as a simple merchant. Ricardo had a complicated history with the cartel. He had lost a brother to a rival gang and had since harbored a deep hatred for the violence that plagued the region. However, Ricardo had always been cautious, preferring to stay out of the cartel war, but his friendship with Alejandro was stronger than his fear. He knew that if nothing was done, the consequences would be irreparable, not only for Alejandro, but for everyone around them. Ricardo decided to act. He sought other secret allies within the city, men and women who, although afraid, were ready to resist what was coming. But this resistance would be slow, and time was against them. The cartel, with its network of influence, was rapidly closing in. However, the real danger lurked in the shadows, closer to Alejandro than he could ever imagine. The observer in the shadows, who had been following Alejandro's every move and the cartel's every move, had an unexpected connection to Alejandro's story. It was someone he knew very well, someone from the past, someone he never imagined would return to his life in such a devastating way. As the siege of Alejandro's farm intensified, the network of allies within the city began to move in a more coordinated manner. But there was a problem. Time was running out. The cartel had information that could destroy everything Alejandro had built. Every move, every second could mean the loss of everything. Desperate, Mariana tried to contact her husband. She knew he needed more time. But amidst the pressure, something unexpected happened. The radio she was using to communicate with Alejandro picked up a conversation between Juanito's henchmen. They were approaching the inside of the house, and at that moment it seemed like their fate was sealed. The night was heavy, and the atmosphere around Alejandro's ranch was thick with the tension of the moments to come. The cartel's henchmen had invaded the property and were spreading throughout the house and fields, searching for any sign of resistance. Alejandro was ready to confront them, but what he didn't know was that while his life was about to crumble, a much greater revelation was about to unfold. Outside, where the bushes and shadows of the night concealed any movement, the observer approached with silent steps. His presence had been a mystery from the start, but now, as events unfolded, the figure in the shadows began to reveal his true nature. Alejandro could never have imagined that this man, whom he thought was merely an occasional ally, was in fact someone with a past deeply intertwined with his own. The observer finally emerged from the shadows and positioned himself near Alejandro. The farmer's eyes narrowed as he recognized the man. It was Gabriel Ruiz, an old childhood friend who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Gabriel, once a promising lawyer, had abandoned everything, including the city, to follow a dark path. What Alejandro didn't know was that, after disappearing, Gabriel had become involved with the cartel itself, but with a purpose different from what anyone could imagine. Gabriel had infiltrated the cartel years ago, trying to uncover who was behind the movements that threatened his hometown. But what he found was a web of betrayal, even more complex than he had imagined. The cartel wasn't just a criminal organization. It was merely a piece in a much larger game, a game involving people Alejandro would never have suspected, even within the city of San Sebastian itself. "Alejandro, you don't know what's at stake here," Gabriel said, his voice low but heavy with urgency. "What you thought was a simple debt collection is just the tip of the iceberg. The cartel isn't after you just for your farm. They're after something far more valuable, and I'm here to stop that from happening." Alejandro looked at him perplexed. He didn't know what to think. Gabriel, the friend he thought was lost forever, was now here, back, but with a secret mission that changed everything. "What do you mean by that?" Alejandro asked, trying to understand. Gabriel took a deep breath, looking around to make sure no one else could hear them. He knew that time was running out. "The cartel isn't just taking control of the region, Alejandro. They want an ancient relic, something that was buried many years ago in San Sebastian, something that has the power to change the course of the entire country. You're in the middle of something much bigger, and there's no way out now. But I can help you stop it from happening, if you trust me." Before Alejandro could answer, the sound of a motorcycle speeding down the road interrupted the conversation. Someone was approaching. Gabriel turned quickly, his eyes narrowing. Danger was drawing ever closer. Alejandro felt the weight of the revelation on his shoulders. What he thought was a simple break-in was turning into a race against time. What would he do now? And who else was involved in this dark game? The impact of Gabriel's words was still weighing on Alejandro's mind when the sound of the motorcycle grew even closer. He didn't know what to think. His old friend, whom he believed lost forever, was now at the center of a conspiracy that involved much more than just the cartel. But before he could react, the motorcycle stopped abruptly, and from the darkness emerged a familiar figure. It was Ricardo, the former police officer, with a tense and hurried expression. He had been warned about the situation and knew the moment was critical. However, the expression on his face was one of despair. Something else was happening. "Alejandro, Gabriel, We have to act fast, Ricardo said, glancing nervously at the road. Juanito's henchmen aren't the only ones here. They're being watched. The whole city is at stake now. Alejandro felt a surge of adrenaline course through his body. What Gabriel had said was beginning to make sense, but he wasn't prepared for what was to come. The cartel, the henchmen, the debts. All of that now seemed like just a distraction, part of a much more elaborate plan. Gabriel, who had remained silent until then, finally stepped forward, looking at Alejandro with a serious gaze. They're not after you just because of the farm. They want to control the whole town. It's not about money. There's something hidden here, and they know you're connected to it. He paused, watching Alejandro's reaction. Something you and your family never knew. Ricardo, who already knew the story, moved closer. I've heard rumors about this, something that was buried in ancient times, but I never knew the cartel would be involved. They already had many roots here, but now this is much bigger. Alejandro was stunned, but his worry was turning into determination. He could no longer ignore the implications of this revelation. The game he believed to be simple was now proving to be far more complex, with unseen forces working in the shadows. He looked at Gabriel, who was watching him with unwavering seriousness. "What should we do now?" Alejandro asked, his voice thick with urgency. Gabriel took a deep breath and looked at Ricardo, who nodded. "We don't have much time. If we don't act now, the cartel will have complete control. We need to get out of here, move to a safer place where we can plan our next steps." But before they could move, a scream cut through the night. The light from several flashlights drew closer, and the sound of truck engines shattered the silence. What had seemed like a simple cartel raid was now becoming a frantic chase, a hunt where Alejandro and his allies were increasingly surrounded. Ricardo and Gabriel looked at Alejandro, awaiting his decision. The situation was critical, and there was no more time for hesitation. Alejandro knew his life would never be the same again. What was at stake now was not just his farm, but the very safety of his family and even the city of San Sebastian. "We're going to fight," Alejandro said, his eyes fixed on the trucks. "We can't let them win. If they want to control all this, they'll have to step over our bodies." Gabriel, with a look that mixed respect and something more somber, nodded. "So get ready, because the fight that's coming will be much bigger than any of us can imagine." Tensions were at their peak. Shadows were drawing near, and everyone's fate was about to be decided. With the pickup trucks rapidly closing in, adrenaline surged through Alejandro. He never imagined his life would take this turn, but now there was no turning back. He was no longer just defending his farm. He was fighting for something much bigger. The safety of his town, the freedom of his family, and the preservation of everything he believed to be right. "Let's go to the main house," Alejandro ordered, taking the lead. "We can hold out longer there. It's the only place with more cover." Ricardo, Gabriel, and Alejandro's other allies followed him quickly, and within minutes they were inside the house. The sound of the trucks stopping in front of the property and the men spreading out across the area reached them. The confrontation was imminent, but Alejandro felt a strange calm within him, something he hadn't felt before. It wasn't fear anymore, it was determination. Gabriel, seeing the change in Alejandro, felt a pang of respect for his friend, who had previously seemed like a simple farmer. Now he was a leader, someone who was ready to face the impossible. "Alejandro, we need a plan. They won't stop. They have more men than us," Gabriel said, his voice tense as he looked out the window and assessed the situation. Alejandro took a deep breath and looked around. He knew the situation was critical, but he also knew that, deep down, he was no longer alone. The fear that had previously dominated him was now transforming into focus. He looked at Ricardo, who was armed and ready, and at Gabriel, who still had a somber air, but with the same determination. "We have to use the terrain to our advantage," said Alejandro, adjusting his posture. "We'll spread out our forces and create traps along the trails. We can force them to follow a predictable path, and then we attack. We can't take them all on at once." But if we manage to isolate some parts of the group, Gabriel and Ricardo exchanged a glance, a sign that Alejandro's idea had meritocracy. They were outnumbered, but even so, the rancher possessed a unique advantage: his knowledge of the land. He knew every corner, every trail, every tree, like no one else. The cartel might be powerful, but Alejandro had a crucial trump card. With the plan outlined, they began to move quickly. Alejandro guided his allies, distributing weapons and pointing out strategic points on the terrain. Gabriel, who was more accustomed to stealth tactics, took on the responsibility of leading a small group to ambush the cartel men advancing along the side trail. Ricardo, with his experience as a former police officer, would help cover the main entrance. But as they prepared for the confrontation, Alejandro felt something different. The pressure of the final moments hadn't broken him. On the contrary, it had strengthened him. He wasn't just defending himself or his farm. He was fighting for something bigger: his land, his history, and the freedom of all those who depended on him. He was facing not only the cartel, but his own fears and limitations. As the first cartel men began to advance along the side trail, the sound of a gunshot echoed through the night. Gabriel, with his impeccable precision, took down the first henchman, and chaos ensued. The sound of gunfire and screams echoed through the ranch, but Alejandro remained focused. He knew this would be the decisive moment. As the confrontation intensified, Alejandro realized that the fight was not just physical, but emotional. He was forging a new version of himself. The farmer who once feared losing everything was now willing to give everything for the greater good. He would no longer be just the man who cared for his land. He was now the defender of his family, his community, and the freedom they all so desperately needed. The battle lasted for hours, but in the end, the cartel was forced to retreat. The battlefield was silent, except for the beads of sweat and the panting sounds of the survivors. Alejandro, his shirt damp and his eyes tired, looked around. They had won, but not without sacrifices. The farm was damaged, and many there knew there was still much to be done. But at that moment, Alejandro felt stronger than ever. He was no longer the farmer who feared the unknown. He had faced his greatest fears, and now he knew he could face anything that came next. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever the future held for him. The momentary victory over the cartel was only a temporary relief. Alejandro's ranch was still surrounded, and the night was far from over. But something had changed within him. He felt a renewed strength, a determination he hadn't possessed before, as if he had awakened to the true magnitude of the fight he was involved in. Now, more than ever, he knew the real battle was yet to come. "We can't stop here," Alejandro said, gathering his allies in the main house. The group was exhausted, but the tension on their faces showed that they all knew the worst was yet to come. "We need to prepare for the next attack. They won't give up so easily. We need to get it right this time." Ricardo nodded, his expression serious. He knew that, despite the partial victory, the cartel still had the strength and resources to regain control. "We can't rely solely on traps," Gabriel said, his eyes still fixed on the shadows of the night. "What they want isn't just our physical defeat. They have information about the city, and if they get to it, it will be the end of us all. They will infiltrate the city, seize strategic points, and divide the population." Alejandro pondered Gabriel's words. They weren't just fighting for the farm. They were defending a way of life, a future. He looked at his wife, Mariana, who was now beside him, observing every move with unusual seriousness. "What do you think, Mariana?" Alejandro asked, his voice thick with concern. Mariana, though still shaken by the events, seemed more resolute than ever. She knew that everyone's future depended on the decisions they made at that moment. "We have to act fast, Alejandro. The cartel has a much wider network than we imagined, and the city will fall. If we don't control this situation now, we can't wait any longer." She looked at Ricardo and Gabriel. "We must attack before they have a chance to reorganize." The pressure on Alejandro was immense. He had never imagined it would come to this, but the reality was undeniable. The farm, his family, his town, everything was at stake. He felt a weight on his chest, a sense of responsibility that deepened with each passing moment. But, at the same time, there was clarity in his mind. He knew what he needed to do. Prepare the city's defenses. He looked at Ricardo. You and Gabriel must ensure that no one enters without our knowledge. I'll make one last offensive. If we can reach the cartel leader, we can end this once and for all. Ricardo and Gabriel exchanged a quick glance before nodding. Understood. We're going to need more allies, Gabriel said with a serious expression. We can't fight alone anymore. Alejandro nodded, knowing that although he had Ricardo and Gabriel's support, the biggest challenge would be gathering those still willing to fight against the cartel. They needed every resource possible to deliver the final blow. Mariana, her eyes fixed on her husband, approached him and gripped his hand tightly. Just be careful, Alejandro. I don't want to lose you to this. You've already done enough. The farmer looked at her with an expression of firmness and love. He knew that if he didn't act now, everything he had built could be destroyed. He couldn't go back. He took a deep breath, feeling the intensity of the moment. I won't let anything separate us, Mariana. I promise. With the plan drawn up and the teams formed, everyone quickly dispersed, each with their own mission. Alejandro felt the pressure on his shoulders, but at the same time, the responsibility made him feel stronger. The fate of everyone was in his hands now, and he was determined to do whatever it took. As he prepared for the final showdown, Alejandro gazed at the horizon, where the first light of dawn was beginning to emerge. He knew this battle wouldn't be easy, but he was ready. The decisive moment was approaching, and the future of the city, his family and his farm depended on one last bold action. The war was about to reach its climax, and everyone knew that victory or defeat would be decided in the next few hours. The sun was beginning to rise over the distant mountains, tinging the sky a somber orange. But the dawn brought no peace to Alejandro. He stood there, watching the horizon, his mind focused on what was to come. The fate of his family, his farm, and his town was about to be decided in a brutal confrontation. The cartel men had reorganized, and now, more than ever, they knew that Alejandro and his allies were ready for battle. The final moment had arrived. Let's do this now, Alejandro said firmly, looking at his allies. The plan is set. We have to neutralize the cartel leader. If we can do that, their power will dissipate. Ricardo and Gabriel nodded, armed and ready for action. The tension was palpable, and everyone knew that, more than ever, every move would be crucial. With the sound of engines and shouts in the background, the cartel's henchmen advanced, surrounding the farm. Alejandro, with a determined look, positioned himself at the head of his allies. They had infiltrated the city, done what was necessary to surround the cartel, and now the final battle was about to take place. The leader, Juanito Ortega, was at the head of the group, with his arrogant smile and unwavering confidence. "Do you really think you can beat me?" Juanito shouted from afar, as if he were enjoying the game. "You have no idea what you're up against, Alejandro. The city is ours now." Alejandro didn't hesitate. He knew what he had to do. With surprising speed, he and Gabriel broke away from the group and advanced toward the heart of the cartel. The fight intensified instantly. The henchmen began firing, but Alejandro and Gabriel's precise movements kept them at bay. "Let's finish this now!" Alejandro shouted to Gabriel as they advanced toward Juanito. The cartel leader was now closer, and the confrontation drew ever closer. Alejandro felt the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He had already lost so much in this battle, but now he could no longer back down. What was at stake was more than his farm, more than his life. It was the future of everyone who depended on him. When they finally came face to face with Juanito, the cartel leader laughed, a low, sarcastic laugh. "Do you really think you can defeat me, Alejandro?" Juanito mocked. "The cartel is stronger than you'll ever be. You and your city are insignificant. There's no way you can win." Without saying a word, Alejandro raised his weapon and fired, but Juanito was faster. The shot narrowly missed. A physical confrontation ensued, and both fought with strength and fury. Alejandro was exhausted, but his movements were precise, fueled by the determination to protect his land and his family. Each blow was a reflection of years of effort, of a lifetime he had dedicated to that land. And he knew he could not lose. Meanwhile, Richard and the other allies fought to keep the rest of the cartel at bay. The sound of gunfire, explosions, and screams filled the air. The farm was being destroyed, but Alejandro no longer cared. He was focused on one thing: ending the threat the cartel posed. In a swift movement, Alejandro managed to immobilize Juanito, forcing him to his knees before him. But before he could act, an unexpected turn of events occurred. Suddenly, one of Juanito's closest henchmen, whom Alejandro thought was dead, appeared from the shadows, armed and ready to attack. "No!" Gabriel shouted, realizing the danger. But it was too late. The henchman fired at Alejandro. The bullet struck the farmer in the shoulder, causing him to fall to the ground with a cry of pain. Blood began to spread across the earth, but Alejandro did not give up. He used his last strength to lift the weapon and, with a final movement, fired at the henchman, instantly bringing him down. Juanito, witnessing the scene, tried to back away, but Gabriel gave him no chance. In a precise movement, he struck the cartel leader, finally knocking him down. Juanito's body fell heavily to the ground. The confrontation was over. The battle was not yet completely won. Some henchmen remained, and the city still needed to be liberated. But Alejandro, breathless and with blood dripping from his shoulder, knew he had won. He had defeated the leader, destroyed the cartel's main force, and now the city had a chance to rise again. The farm was destroyed. The battle Alejandro had fought for so many weeks had left its mark not only on his property, but also on his soul. The sound of screams and gunfire had finally ceased, and the silence that followed was both a relief and a burden. He had won, but the cost had been high. Alejandro sat on the porch of the house, his shoulders aching and his gaze lost. His arm was immobilized, but the physical pain was nothing compared to what he felt in his heart. The cartel had been defeated, but the scars of war were still visible all around him. Mariana, who had remained silent during the battle, approached her husband. She looked at him with eyes full of concern, but also with deep gratitude. She knew that he had faced the impossible, and that the fight for the freedom of his city had been the greatest of all. "You did what needed to be done, Alejandro. The city is safe. You did it," she said softly, touching her husband's shoulder. Alejandro, with a tired expression, looked at her and smiled, although it was a weak smile. "I couldn't have done this without you, Mariana. Without all of you." He paused, gazing at the horizon where the sunlight was beginning to illuminate the farm. "The battle isn't over, but the city now has a chance to rise again, and we have a chance to rebuild our lives." Gabriel and Ricardo approached each other. The former police officer was visibly shaken, but his gratitude for having helped Alejandro achieve victory was clear in his eyes. Gabriel, on the other hand, seemed more introspective than ever. "The fight isn't just yours, Alejandro," Gabriel said with a serious look, "but you're the one who kept us all together. Today the city is free, and that's thanks to you." Ricardo sighed in agreement. He knew things wouldn't be easy from now on. The cartel had deep roots in the city, and the rebuilding process would be long and arduous. But the worst was over. "The road ahead will be difficult, but together we can rebuild what has been destroyed," he said, with the confidence of someone who knew that, despite the challenges, victory was possible. Alejandro looked at his friends and his wife, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. Although the future was uncertain, he knew he was no longer alone. He had overcome his greatest fears, faced his demons, and become the leader his city needed. He looked at the land before him, the field he had protected with such effort, and smiled with renewed confidence. The farm might be damaged, but its essence remained intact. And most importantly, his life, his family, and his town were safe. Now it was time to start over. Months had passed since the victory over the cartel. Alejandro, Mariana, and their children were rebuilding the ranch, now stronger and more united than ever. The city of San Sebastian, though still scarred by the battle, had begun to recover. Peace finally reigned, but in the distance, in the mountains, a new gaze watched over the city. The cartel's shadow would not disappear easily. Alejandro knew that the real fight for freedom was only beginning. With renewed courage, he was ready to face any new challenge. And although the victory was sweet, the war for peace was not yet over. Now that you know about Alejandro's epic journey and his fight against the cartel, we want to know, what do you think comes next? Alejandro's victory was just the beginning, but the future is full of challenges. Share your opinion and keep following to see how the characters will face each other again in the shadows of this new danger. Did you enjoy this story? Don't miss the next adventures. Subscribe and share with your friends. What would you do in Alejandro's place? Leave your comment below and tell us how you think this saga will continue.